Hello, everybody. I'm here with Kane B. We are going to be talking about moral error theory. So, Kane, if you would like to introduce yourself or anything, or reference your where you can be found.
Okay, well, I'm Kane B. Kane Baker, whatever you prefer. I'm currently doing a philosophy PhD, coming to the end of it, and I have a YouTube channel on which I upload videos on philosophy. Had it for quite a long time now. I think I've got like hundreds of videos on there. So if anybody isn't familiar with me, they can check me out on YouTube. Does that work?
Yeah, cool. I'll put the link to your channel in the description if anyone wants to check it out. Um, Yeah, so I guess let's just get into it. So I guess in terms of just starting off in the broadest possible respect, what do you take error theory to mean, just in terms of what sort of like core propositions or ideas do you think constitute the theory?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, we're talking in the context of metaethics. So, this is going to be a claim about moral judgments. So, error theory is a type of anti-realism. I think that so. First of all, the error theorists will say that our moral judgments are attempting to state facts about the world. So, when I say, for instance, slavery is wrong, I'm expressing a belief that slavery is wrong, or I'm, attributing the property of wrongness to slavery, something like that. That contrasts with views in metaethics, which would say that when somebody makes a moral judgment, they're really just expressing like attitudes or emotions. So that slavery is wrong really just means boo to slavery. If you endorse that kind of view, then there's no question about whether slavery is wrong is true or false, or whether there are moral facts or anything like that. Like if you think that when we make moral judgments, we're just expressing emotions or expressing attitudes, then there's no further question to be asked about whether there are any moral facts. Error theory endorses, I mean, the technical term is cognitivism. Error theory endorses this cognitivist position that moral judgments are propositions or beliefs, right? They're things that we can evaluate as being true or false. And then traditionally, error theory will be defined as the claim that all of these judgments are false. And the reason why they're false is that there are no moral facts. So the analogy would be to something like discourse about witches. When we judge that somebody is a witch, or when people in the past judged that somebody was a witch, all of those types of judgments were false because there are no witches. The whole like witchcraft discourse it presupposed an error. I think that it's not obvious that error theory actually should be characterized in this way. I don't know if maybe I should stop here and we can talk about what I've just said, or if I should go on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Did what I say
yeah,
make sense?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, there's two sort of general claims that I'm picking up on. One is that when we think about sort of the meaning of moral statements, error theory is going to claim that moral statements, in terms of what they mean, presuppose the existence of some objective moral facts. But since no such objective moral facts exist, the claim that killing babies is wrong is going to be false in the same way that God loves you is false, right? Because you're assuming the existence of a non-existent entity.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the sort of the next question that I wanted to ask was just sort of when we talk about objective morality, it sounds like a lot of people kind of have some idea of what that means. But I guess to just be more precise, what do you take the claim that objective morality doesn't exist to mean? Um,
Yeah, well, that will, I suppose, depend on like how a somebody with more realist inclinations might be characterizing it. Because, I mean, obviously there's a whole bunch of different kinds of realism. Um, and, you know, so some people will say that moral facts are like, you know, non-natural, others will try to sort of reduce morality to natural facts. But, like, I think that the exactly what it is that the error theorist is targeting, it's probably not necessarily helpful to say. I mean, it's true, right, to say that they deny that there are objective moral facts, but it's not necessarily helpful because the problem that they might have with objective moral facts may be different depending on the error theorist. So here's an example, right? So the sort of father of error theory is a guy called J.L. Mackie. And what Mackie says is that moral facts, if they existed, would be the kind of things that would have this motivational force to them. So what Mackie says is that if there were objective moral facts, then merely coming to know what those facts are would motivate you to act in accordance with them. So there's a motivational force to them. So when I come to know that slavery is morally wrong, that will motivate me not to enslave people. And Mackie says that there just couldn't be anything that plays this role. Like the idea that there could be something in the world that motivates somebody, that like pushes them in a particular direction, regardless of what their desires are. He thinks that that's just nonsense, right? But the problem is that a lot of realists, I think, will deny that morality needs to be taken to have this motivational force. In fact, I think that would probably be a pretty, these days, a minority position. Most of the realists that I've spoken to would grant that, like, yeah, I mean, you know, there could be somebody who's just a sociopath who recognizes the moral facts but just doesn't care, right? So in that respect, Mackie kind of overplays his hand, right? So you know, so that's like one objection we might have is to this idea that, you know, moral facts have a motivational force. Another, and I think much more plausible line we might take is that the problem with objective moral facts is that they provide reasons for action that are independent of our desires. And this is also suggested in Mackie as well. It's just he doesn't kind of make it clear exactly what the distinction is between these positions. But so the thought is that if we say that it's like when I say, for instance, slavery is wrong, you ought not to enslave people. That is binding on you regardless of what any of your desires are, right? So, you know, you can't say, well, like, you know, I don't care how the person being enslaved feels. You can't sort of remove yourself from the authority of moral facts in that kind of way. So, you know, there's this distinction that we sometimes draw between hypothetical and categorical imperatives, where a hypothetical imperative would be something of the form, if you want X, you ought to do Y. So like, I can say to somebody, you know, it's raining, if you want to stay dry, put on a coat. And you can release yourself from like the authority of that imperative by saying, well, I don't care whether I get wet or not, right? If I don't care whether or not I get wet, then, you know, there's no reason for me to put on a coat. In the case of morality, you can't do that, right? Morality is binding on you regardless of your desires, regardless of what your sort of social role is, okay? And so that, again, is something that I think a lot of contemporary error theorists have a problem with. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yes, I think that's a good starting point. Is a lot of it, I think it's pretty popular to think of morality in terms of reasons nowadays, where what you ought to do just translates to what you have most reason to do. And a moral realist is just going to say that you have some reason for action, which is unconditional upon any desire that you have. So like, for example, a moral realist might say, you ought to donate to charity, or you have reason to donate to charity, whether or not you want to donate to charity. Whereas an error theorist or a moral anti-realist is going to say you only really have reason to do this if you actually have a desire to do this. Does that roughly track on to your understanding?
Yeah, so I think then that if we take this kind of view of the debate, then error theory will be the claim that, first of all, moral judgments kind of presuppose that there is this categorical normativity, that there are categorical reasons for action in the sense that we've described. But then the claim will be that there just are no such things. Now, I mean, I should point out that it seems to me like that's pretty much all you need to be an error theorist, right? So the point then is, if you accept those two things, then you accept that there's essentially a kind of false presupposition, an error in our moral judgments. Whether you then want to take the further step of saying that all moral judgments are false is not entirely obvious, only because truth can be, at least on some philosophical views, quite cheap. So, you know, I said at the beginning that error theory is traditionally characterized as a view that all moral judgments are false, but I'm not sure that that's really like essential to the position. I think the essential point is that moral judgments contain a false presupposition, which is in some sense like central to them, to their status as moral judgments. Because it kind of seems like, you know, if you were to just make a hypothetically imperative claim, if you were to make the claim like, you know, you ought to put on a jacket if you don't want to get wet, that kind of thing just can't be a moral judgment because it's just dependent on people's desires. It seems like what's essential to morality is this authority that it has, the fact that it is binding upon us regardless of what our desires are. And so, yeah, I think that's probably how I would prefer to characterize error theory, is to say that it's the view that moral judgments contain a false presupposition. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, yeah, let's start with the first part of error theory, which basically asserts that, or maybe it's the second part. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to the order, I guess. Let's start with the part that says that there are no such categorical norms or desire-independent reasons, and maybe consider some of the considerations or arguments which might lead us to accept that conclusion. I know we talked about some of these beforehand, about, you know, which considerations you find persuasive. And so I thought maybe we could start with the queerness argument. The queerness argument, for those who aren't familiar, was, I think, I'm pretty certain it was first put forth by J.L. Mackie in his book Inventing Right and Wrong, where he basically ascribed a bunch of characteristics to moral properties and then said, basically, look, if objective moral facts did exist, they would be utterly unlike everything else that we can see in the universe. And I know there's a lot of contention, for example, over what those features are. You know, like someone like Jonas Olson will want to say that queerness resides in the fact that these properties are irreducibly normative. And other people will want to say that it resides in the fact that they're categorical. So I guess I was just wondering, with respect to the queerness argument, maybe you could lay out your form of the argument a little bit and maybe explain firstly, what the queerness of objective moral properties consist of in your view, like what makes them queer, and additionally, why the queerness of morality should be a problem for the moral realist.
Okay. There's a few things there. I actually just want to clarify something, and this is maybe pedantic, but it might be important depending on what we discuss later. So you mentioned that you said something like, you know, the error theorist denies categorical normativity, categorical reasons. I would just to be specific, I think it's categorical reasons for action.
Right.
That a moral error theorist would want to deny. There may be other types of categorical reasons that they don't necessarily have a problem with. But yeah, so, okay. The queerness argument. Well, you know, Mackie presents like these sort of two prongs to it, a metaphysical and an epistemological one. I think that, you know, it seems like we're kind of hinting towards the metaphysical prong here, so I'll just talk about that. I think that So the first thing to say, oh, and I should also say, I mean, you mentioned like my form of the queerness argument. I don't really want to take credit for any particular form of the queerness argument.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, just the
so
version you find
you know,
persuasive, I
yeah.
guess.
So
Yeah.
I think that you know, when somebody states a moral theory, they're going to be doing like two things, right? First of all, a moral theory will specify what states are considered valuable, and then secondly, it will specify how we ought to act with respect to those states. So, you know, if you take, for instance, utilitarianism, like a classical utilitarianism will say that the valuable state is pleasure, and the, you know, disvalue is pain, and then it will tell you that how you ought to act with respect to that is to just maximize pleasure. But there are, you know, other sort of views you might take here. You might agree with the utilitarian that ultimately pleasure and pain are all that's valuable, but then you might have a very different view about how you ought to act with respect to that. So somebody who's, you know, has more deontological inclinations will say that instead of just acting so as to, you know, maximize pleasure, to promote pleasure, we should, you know, maybe act in such a way that we, in the specific actions that we do, never bring about pain in anybody else. So for a utilitarian, you know, you can, if you bring about pain in one person, but this brings about more pleasure overall, the utilitarian will tell you to do it. Somebody with a more deontological approach won't. So the reason why I make that distinction is that I think that, you know, you can run the queerness argument on both parts. So I know, does that distinction make sense, right? Like there's a claim about what's valuable, and then there's a claim about how you ought to act with respect to it. I think that with the idea of like objective values, that certain things are objectively valuable and objectively disvaluable. Is that a word? I should know
Yes,
the
I
word.
think so.
Right. Anyway, so what seems, I think, weird about that, or queer about that, is the idea that there is like some way that the universe or the world is meant to be. So, you know, there are ways of making sense of this idea, right? So if somebody believes that the universe is created by God, and that God has like specified a certain plan for humanity or something like that, then it's like, okay, well, you've sort of reduced the way the world is meant to be to God's desires or to God's plan for humanity. If God has like a particular way that he wants humans to be, then it's like, okay, you've got a sense in which the universe, the world, is meant to be a certain way, that we are meant to be a certain way. But you know, if you remove that aspect of it, if you just have like a, you know, a secular worldview, where you, I don't know, maybe you're a materialist and so you think the universe consists of just atoms in motion, or you know, even if you start postulating other things, you know, you can postulate abstract entities like abstract mathematical sets or whatever. You know, no matter what we do in terms of describing how the universe is, it's not clear how you make the jump from that to a claim about how the world is meant to be. So that's one type of queerness. Then, with the idea that we ought to act in a certain way, well, we have this problem that we've already mentioned of categorical reasons for action, right? So let's just grant that there are objective values, right? Let's grant that like pain is objectively bad and pleasure is objectively good. Well, there's now like this whole other leap from that, right, to the idea that like I ought to act in such a way as to minimize pain, right? Why couldn't I just say, you know, well, I don't care what the objective values are, right? You know, in that case, like if I don't care that pain is objectively bad, then why shouldn't I, you know, stab somebody in order to, I don't know, take their money, like if it would benefit me to do so. Yeah, I think that, you know, the way that Mackie puts it is quite nice. He says that what's bizarre is the idea that there are certain like actions that, or certain things that have a to be doneness or not to be doneness somehow built into them, or that there's, you know, a demand without a demander, right? Like the world somehow makes demands on you right? Even though there's no particular person or entity making those demands, right? I think that that's probably it seems to me, the best way of running a queerness argument. So it's not just, in some ways I do think that the term queerness argument is perhaps a bit misleading, because it's kind of like there's a tendency to just take it as though the error theorist is saying, well, like morality would just be weird, and I guess that's part of what they're saying, but there's lots of things that might be weird, right? Like you can read the literature on quantum mechanics and you'll come across lots of really weird stuff there. Or if you believe that there are objective mathematical facts, like there are objective abstract mathematical entities, maybe that's weird. But so it's more specifically, I think it's the idea that the world is meant to be a certain way, and the idea that there can be reasons that bind you regardless of your desires, would be, I think, probably the most persuasive forms of the queerness argument.
Okay, yeah. And so what specifically about those features is meant to be sort of a consideration against realism? Are we sort of saying that maybe you hinted that it wasn't really the case, that we're making sort of an argument from intuition, where it's like these things feel very unintuitive and that counts against us believing in those things? I've heard some versions of the argument where basically it's an appeal to naturalism, where we're just saying like there's no counterpart in terms of what we can observe in a sort of materialist naturalist framework, and therefore we should reject these things. So I guess I'm just wondering how you specifically make that connection between moral properties have these characteristics, to therefore we should reject their existence.
So, I don't think that naturalism is really necessary here. And I mean, just to clarify the way I see it, like I think that I don't know, maybe you accept a sort of substance dualist view of the mind, right? So you think that mind and matter are fundamentally different types of thing. It's not really clear to me how that would do anything to explain how, for instance, there could be reasons that are binding on you regardless of your desires. It wouldn't do anything to explain how the world is meant to be a certain way. Similarly, as I said, like you can postulate abstract entities. It's not entirely obvious that would fit into a materialist framework either. I mean, actually, when Mackie first gave this argument, he did frame it in terms of naturalism, but I don't think that's really necessary. I mean, I think that, like, the way that I would, I guess, make the connection is just more in terms of, well, like, okay, what exactly are reasons? I guess here I would just appeal to, my, like, assumptions about, I don't know, human psychology or something, and say, yeah, like a reason, when you have a reason to do something, that ultimately reduces to some of your desires. I mean, in some ways, I suppose it's possible for somebody to just, like, reject the claim that there's anything queer here, right? Or that there's anything problematic here. It would be possible for somebody to just say, okay, moral judgments involve an assumption that there are categorical reasons for action, right? That there are reasons binding on you regardless of your desires, but I don't see the problem with that. I mean, all I can say is it seems like everybody does see the problem with that, including realists, because they will come up with various arguments to try to explain this. I don't know if that's, like, is that an intuition? Maybe.
Yeah.
But it seems to be universally shared and, like, universally recognized as an issue. So
Yeah, I think that's fair, especially considering how, a lot of the modern arguments for realism are arguments from intuition. If you look at, like, humor, for example, and I think that the queerness argument can be an interesting way of sort of, I guess, undercutting that, where it's like, sure, maybe it does feel really intuitive to say that, really unintuitive to say that, murdering children isn't wrong, but it also feels, very unintuitive to say that these properties exist with all of these characteristics that seem very hard to accept the existence of. Um, I could also kind of see it being an appeal to maybe a form of like ontological parsimony or something, but maybe that's a separate argument. But I could see the argument kind of relating to that in some way.
Oh no, I mean, yeah, I think that's definitely how some people would prefer to run it. Like, so generally speaking, a like criteria that we use for theory selection is that we want our theories to be simple. Simple in the sense that they don't multiply entities beyond necessity or whatever. And it looks like, if you can explain everything about our moral practices without postulating entities, let's say, I don't know if you necessarily want to characterize moral properties as entities, but properties or entities or something like that, that are very unlike properties that we're familiar with in other contexts, then parsimony would prefer that option. I mean, yeah, I think for me it's just more like, okay, well, I don't know. I mean, all I can say is I can't make sense of the idea that there might be reasons for action that are like binding upon me regardless of my desires, and nobody has ever explained it in a way that does make it make sense, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm not actually sure that is an intuition. I think that's maybe more just a lack of understanding. Maybe you might say, well, that's my problem, right? Like, if you don't understand it, that's just a lack of imagination on your part. But again, right, the fact that even realists seem to recognize that there is something to be explained here, kind of suggests that no, this is something we sort of recognize as an issue. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And what about the epistemic side of it? How would you kind of cash out the queerness in terms of what's strange about the idea that we could have sort of epistemic access to moral facts?
So if we think about how it is that we form beliefs in general, if you just kind of go through the different ways that we have of doing that, the epistemic queerness argument is going to say, well, that none of those work, right? So that we end up having to postulate some entirely separate faculty for recognizing what the moral facts are. So perception is an obvious one, right? Like we form beliefs by the sensory data that we get through our eyes and ears and other, senses, and that doesn't look like it's going to be enough to get us moral facts, because people can perceive exactly the same thing but make completely different moral judgments about it. It's not really like if I, for instance, set fire to a dog, well, a lot of people would say that's morally wrong. Now, okay, there are various things that we can perceive there. We can, see the flames. We can see the dog writhing in pain. We can hear its squeals of agony. We can maybe smell the burning flesh, all of that. But none of that is the wrongness itself. So, okay, perception isn't enough. Then another way that we might form beliefs is just through kind of logical reasoning. We have some prior belief that P, and then prior belief that Q, and maybe we are able to reason, well, if P holds and Q holds, then the conjunction P and Q must hold. But again, it seems if you're going to get moral beliefs that way, you'd have to have some prior moral beliefs to start with, because logic is conservative, right? You don't get out more than you put in. There's inference to the best explanation, where we will form a hypothesis, judge it against certain explanatory criteria, does it allow us to draw lots of novel predictions? Is it simple? Does it have wide explanatory scope? And then the argument there is going to be that actually morality ends up, like, first of all, like when we make moral judgments, right, that doesn't seem to involve making any predictions about things, for instance. So it's not like in science, right, where, you know, you form a hypothesis, draw a prediction, make an observation. That's not really how we judge moral beliefs. Moreover, the minute you postulate moral facts, you face a whole load of puzzling questions, such as, you know, who has moral status? Under what conditions are people morally responsible for their actions? You know, what is the right moral theory, right? Well, the minute you postulate moral facts, you've got a whole load of other work to do. So it doesn't seem to be very simple. So, you know, all of these other ways of coming to have beliefs about things don't seem to work. And so, you know, what you're left with, at least this is what Mackie said, is some, you know, special faculty of moral intuition, which he says is a lame answer, but that's basically the answer you're forced to. So, yeah, that's the idea of the epistemic queerness argument.
Okay, yeah. So, right. So, in terms of another argument that was not originally put forth by Mackie, but has nonetheless become pretty prominent in a lot of the literature. What do you make of the evolutionary debunking argument? Maybe we could unpack that a little bit, first by just sort of exploring like the more basic level idea of a debunking argument and, you know, what a debunking argument is supposed to be, and then how error theorists can use evolution to sort of employ a debunking argument that undermines the case for objective morality.
Yeah, okay, so general idea of debunking, I think, is fairly straightforward. Let's say that you, I don't know, read a book about some tribe in the Amazon, let's say. And so you come to form various beliefs about this tribe. And like, yeah, the book is presented as an ethnography of this tribe in the Amazon. So you hold various beliefs because, you know, hey, it's a published book on it, you know, it's trustworthy. But then I show you that actually this book was just made up, like it was a fiction. And the person who wrote it admits that it was a fiction. There's no controversy about that, right? The whole thing was just made up. Well, it looks like you should probably give up your beliefs about this tribe in the Amazon. So the point is that the way that you formed your beliefs, or the, you know, grounds that you had for your beliefs, are not appropriately connected to the thing that your belief is about, right? So, you know, in a normal ethnography, what will happen is that a researcher will go off to a tribe, live with them, right, study them, interact with them, and then write that stuff down on the paper. And then you read it and you form beliefs. And there's a connection there between, you know, the reason you formed your beliefs and what the belief is about. Whereas in the case of somebody who's just made something up, right, that connection has been severed, or there just is no connection in the first place. And I don't know, like, it's possible that everything in that book could be true, right? Like, it's logically possible that there just might be a tribe in the Amazon that does indeed behave in exactly the ways described in this book, right? But it would be extraordinarily unlikely. So, you know, I guess the sort of technical term would be that like that person that you've got your beliefs from, or the book, it's like off track. It doesn't track the truth. Maybe it just happens to hit on the truth by luck, but it doesn't track the truth, right? So in the case of an evolutionary debunking argument, the idea would be, look, our moral beliefs are explained by our evolutionary history. But our evolutionary history is going to be off track with respect to those moral beliefs. So, you know, right, like, we hold the moral beliefs we do because those beliefs promoted survival and reproduction, but there's no connection there, right, to the truth of those beliefs. So those beliefs are unjustified. So, I mean, I guess a similar example of this would be, like, there are explanations of, say, religious belief which will appeal to evolutionary history. So, you know, they'll appeal to the, like, human tendency to anthropomorphize and to pattern recognition. And then there are evolutionary explanations for things like, why we developed certain rituals and things like that, right? So, like in that case, the thought is, well, you'd have those beliefs regardless of whether or not the formation of the belief is not connected to what it is that would make the belief true, right? In the case of religion, what it is that would make the belief true is, if there really was a creator of the universe, but the claim is that people would have developed religious beliefs anyway, or that those beliefs are not connected to the truth of that. And so you can run the same kind of argument with morality. So it's in general, right? Like your moral beliefs are explained by evolutionary history, but evolutionary history is off track with respect to the moral facts. So your moral beliefs are unjustified. That's the general idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just to sort of, I guess, draw an analogy to maybe an area where people are more prone to not be realists, right? I mean, we could say that, like, imagine that humans evolved to think that a certain kind of berry is gross because that berry, like, poisoned us, right? Mm-hmm. And then we can show why evolutionarily we developed the belief that that form of berry was gross. It was because it was evolutionary advantageous for us to think that that kind of berry was gross. But that kind of suggests that just because we developed to have that belief, that doesn't mean that the berry is objectively gross, right? In some, mind independent sense or something like that. I think that largely makes sense, right? Because the process through which we developed our moral beliefs, we don't have any reason to think that that was a process that was really tracking any sort of deeper truth. Mm-hmm. And I guess you drew an analogy to religion, and I guess that's a good jumping off point to one potential objection to the argument, which is just that, maybe just because the source of our morality or our moral beliefs is a process which is non-truth tracking, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't form independent sort of arguments that get us to that conclusion, in the same way that maybe our belief in God came about because of sort of evolutionary reasons, but that doesn't mean we can't come up with like a cosmological argument or something that will still get us to that conclusion. So I guess in light of that sort of sentiment, what role do you think that the evolutionary debunking argument plays?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I like to draw a distinction, which I don't often see drawn in the literature, but it seems to me to be really important, between two ways of running this argument. So, one target that we might have is our specific, the specific content of our moral beliefs. So, we might say, well, let's assume, right, for the sake of argument, that there are moral truths, right? Well, it's going to turn out that evolution has influenced our moral judgments, right, in such a way that those judgments are not tracking with respect to what the moral truths are. So, that's going to, again, undermine whatever normative beliefs we happen to hold. I think, the sort of, I don't know if she was the kind of first to present it, but one of the sort of classic statements of the evolutionary debunking argument comes from someone called Sharon Street, and I think that's the sort of line she takes, which is to say, well, we can just assume that there are moral truths, right? Evolutionary influences would have produced the content of our beliefs in a way that doesn't track what those truths are. But you can also run the argument against the whole framework of moral concepts, right? So you can say that people would have beliefs that things are good, or that things ought to be done, or that things are bad and ought not to be done, right? We would have this conceptual framework regardless of whether or not there actually are any moral truths. So I guess one way to think about this distinction is, on the first type of argument, the claim is that we would favour certain types of normative systems even if the moral facts were completely different. And then on the second type of argument, it would be we would be furnished with moral concepts, right? Even if those concepts just didn't, like actually refer to anything. I don't know if I've made that distinction clear. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
So,
Yeah.
because the important point is that, so the point that you raised, I think, is probably a good, or it may be a good answer to the first argument, like that like, our moral intuitions, our moral judgments would not kind of track the moral facts. I'm not so sure that it's successful in response to the second type of argument. But now I'm saying that, I can't remember exactly what it was you said. And so, so it's just this point that, we can come to the correct, like we might come to realize that there are moral facts on the basis of further arguments, like people present further arguments for God. Actually, no, that actually works in response to both. I mean, obviously the claim there is going to be that the realist arguments are not successful. So it's like, yeah, I mean, sure, right? Like what this argument does is it serves to undermine moral intuitions, like a lot of it might have the role of a kind of burden of proof shifting sort of thing, because a lot of realists will say, well, moral realism is the commonsensical position. Everybody has these moral intuitions, like you just know that slavery is wrong, or that setting fire to puppies is wrong, or whatever. But this kind of argument would say, well, you'd have those intuitions regardless of whether or not there are moral facts. Or so, one thing it might be doing is that. But I would certainly grant that, yeah, I mean, if a realist were to present a convincing argument for the existence of moral facts, then I would accept that. I just don't think there are any such arguments. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? So like one thing that it does is it kind of, assuming that it goes through, it sort of takes arguments from intuition off the table, right? Where if someone's proof for moral realism is a sort of like a Morean shift of like, oh, it's just so unintuitive to say that, murdering children isn't wrong. Well, then the evolutionary debunking argument kind of is a successful response to that sort of appeal. And maybe the other thing is just that, maybe more as a positive argument, it kind of sort of intuitively, it does add an extra layer of skepticism. Right. Yeah. So it's sort of like an analogy I could give. It may be sort of like a silly analogy I was just sort of thinking of. It's like if I'm in the park with two of my friends and one of my friends says, hey, I just saw like a giant purple dinosaur over there, I'm going to be like pretty skeptical, right? But then if my other friend says, by the way, he just took like LSD, I'm going to be like even more skeptical, right? And so the extent to which my friend number one would have to provide evidence to show that there is actually a purple dinosaur, it's going to be a higher degree of evidence than it was before I was made aware of that information.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess going back to my like initial characterization of debunking in general, right? Like in the same way with this tribe in the Amazon, right? Somebody could come along and present evidence that actually this book that was written as a fiction just did happen to get things right, and in that case, we change our judgments. But just in general, it seems like if we recognize that certain beliefs about a domain D, right, that we hold those beliefs for reasons that would be unrelated to the facts about domain D, right? Once you recognize that, then it does seem like that undermines the grounds that you have for those beliefs, right? That seems like a pretty
right
intuitive. I don't know. I don't like how much we're appealing to intuitions here, but like that does seem to be how people reason about these sorts of cases. So if you can show that like we would believe that there are moral facts, or that we would have a tendency to postulate moral facts or to talk as if there were moral facts, regardless of whether or not there are actually any moral facts. I think,
Mhm.
like you say, it adds a layer of skepticism. I like that way of putting it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another way of putting it could just be that, like, look, if we developed this belief through a non-truth tracking process and then it just happened to be true, I mean, that would be a huge coincidence, right? Which is kind of the source of, I think, maybe that extra layer of skepticism, is that for the moral realist position to be correct, they would have to demonstrate that this like massive coincidence, it just happened to be true, right? Yeah, so I think that'll make sense. Another, I think, unless you have anything else to say about evolutionary debunking argument. Yeah.
I mean, I like, obviously I am an error theorist, as I have, I don't know, did I mention that? I'm not sure if I actually said that I was, but yeah, no, I mean, I feel the need to point out that actually, like, realists have tried to meet this explanatory burden, right? So, you know, I mean, I've sort of been talking here as though, yeah, like, we can show that beliefs are like off track because our beliefs about the moral domain like are not appropriately connected to the moral facts, but actually there are plenty of realist responses. You know, there are realists who've tried to show that no, right, there will be appropriate connections. So, you know, even if you can accept the evolutionary story, so I just to give you a sense of how this kind of line might work. So, God, I'm. There are so many responses, and I can't immediately think of one off the top of my head, which is annoying. But okay, here's an example, right? Let's say you know, feeding your children, right? Feeding your children, right? Obviously, we would. So that can figure in that the fact that feeding your children promotes their survival figures in an evolutionary explanation of why we believe it's good to feed them, right? Like, it makes sense, right, that we have the belief that it's morally good to feed your children and not to beat up your children, because that promotes their survival. And obviously, you know, they have like 50% of your genes, and you know, so there's an evolutionary explanation for that. But you could also say, well, that figures in the moral explanation of why it's good to feed them. So the fact that feeding them promotes their survival and makes them happy and so on, that figures in a moral explanation of why it's good to feed them. And so, you know, like, what realists will often do is they'll say, well, as long as we assume that we do have access to some moral facts, right, we can actually use that sort of that basis to, you know, draw connections between what the moral facts are and the evolutionary story about why we believe what we do about the moral facts. Those responses are available.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've read some of Humer's responses to the evolutionary debunking argument. Like, I think he makes this appeal to, like, maybe our moral beliefs or our moral faculties are just a product of some third thing that was truth tracking, like our ability to reason or be rational or something like that. So I guess in terms of other, I guess, considerations, there is one that I heard you talk about before that I thought was really interesting, that I'd never really thought about before, which is the sort of appeal to like a first order incoherence or sort of incompatibility among first order moral judgments that we have. And there are sort of two versions of this argument, that I've heard at least. There's the one that you present, sort of with reference to our deontological intuitions and our utilitarian intuitions. And then there's sort of Cowie's appeal to population axiology. And that one's going to be a little bit more of a mouthful to sort of explain in terms of all the axioms. So how would you cash out your version of that argument?
I mean, if you want to explain the Cowie argument, you'll have to do that, because I can't remember. I can't remember the axioms in question. But this is really annoying to me, right? I hate this argument, and the reason why I hate it is this. So I just happened. This was like, what was this? I don't know, probably like 6 months ago or something. I happened to be reading this article by Thomas Nagel, and he just said, I can't remember what the line was, but he said a line which like something clicked in my head, and I was like, oh my goodness, like maybe morality is just inconsistent. And I then kind of had this idea that that there are like there are two forms of reasoning that are both essential to morality, right? They're like ineliminable to it. They're fundamental to it, but they're just incompatible, right? And so it's inconsistent, right, for that reason. And I presented this argument to a few people that I know. I was like, hey, what do you think of this idea? And I can say that none of them were convinced. My friend Cole, she's also an error theorist. So, she should have been sympathetic to it, but she thought that it was a bad argument. But even so, it was my argument, and I came up with it. And it's the idea that morality is just inconsistent. And then, like, as soon as I mentioned this online, I mentioned it to somebody on a discussion online, and someone was like, oh, like last month, this guy published a paper which has the same basic idea, but, it's also developed in a lot more like technical detail. And, he's a professional philosopher. He's been a professional philosopher for a lot longer, than me. So his argument is much better. He's got a much better version of it than you have. They didn't say that to me, but that was what I took from it. It's like, for God's sake, if I'd just come up with this like 2 years ago or something, then maybe I could have like an argument to my name, and I don't because of this. So you're right, it's Christopher Cowie, Christopher Cowie's first order incoherence argument. But I have a different version. And so the thought is this, right? It seems like, morality in general, right? We have these intuitions that pull us in two directions. And one direction is consequentialist, right? One direction pulls us towards promoting values, right? So we want to, maximize value. So this is a kind of utilitarian calculation where it's like, like if you've got like one person on an island and there's 10 people on another island and there's some, a terrible disaster heading their way like a hurricane, and you can only save like one of them, obviously you go for the 10 people, okay? Because 10, more than one, right? Better save 10 than one. But then, we also have these deontological intuitions where it's like, well, what's the kind of classic example of like a trolley case where, there's 5 people on the track and you can push a guy off the track. You can push a guy in front of the trolley to stop it from killing the other 5. In those kinds of cases, we tend towards thinking in terms of like rights. People have a right to life that should not be violated, even to save the lives of many other people. And, there's a tension, right, between these. And so this is where a great deal of the debate in the history of moral philosophy comes from. People have been trying to work out a way of making these two ways of moral reasoning compatible. And so, you get all of the, like, rule utilitarianism and threshold deontology, but it turns out on analysis, they all have problems as well. So, there's a sort of history. You can look at the history of moral philosophy as a kind of history of failure, right? A history of failure to bring these two things together. It also seems like, you can't just, like, eliminate them, right? So, one option might be to say, well, we should just ignore the, deontological intuitions or ignore the consequentialist intuitions. But that seems really implausible, right? Like, just kind of becoming like just a hardcore consequentialist where it is just nothing, that you are just maximizing without being concerned about honoring certain values. A lot of people have found that an implausible way to go. So, the thought is then, there's a way of looking at this where this seems actually like it's going to be quite nice for the moral anti-realist, because, we could just embrace the inconsistency, right? Like, instead of putting in all of this work at trying to fit these together and work out, okay, what are the moral facts, right? Maybe we should just accept that, yeah, it's inconsistent, right? Morality as a whole is inconsistent. And if it's inconsistent, then it's not true, right? That's the basic idea. And that was something that I came up with on my own. And I was very pleased until I discovered that somebody else had come up with it in a slightly different way. But yeah, I have it. So yeah, I have a sort of love-hate relationship with that argument.
Yeah. So it seems like the basic idea is just there are these two aspects of our moral reasoning, and they're both sort of essential components of our moral reasoning, and they're incompatible. Mm-hmm. And if they're essential and incompatible, then the whole project of morality is just kind of like, where do we go from here? Because the concept of morality is just internally incoherent.
So, I mean, to be clear, I don't necessarily object to the project of morality, right? Like, I don't mind. I mean, I'm quite happy to make moral judgments. I'm not a moral abolitionist, although I'm sympathetic to it, but I'm not. I mean, I will continue to make moral judgments, and I think there's probably something quite useful about morality. So, I mean, the point is just, it's a problem for a realist, right?
Right.
If you take a more anti-realist approach, then because what we're concluding from this is, right, in that case, right, there is no correct moral theory. Well, that's a problem for a realist. But if you don't think there are correct moral theories anyway, then that fits very nicely. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't see this as being like a knockdown argument. Obviously, the response from a realist will be to say, well, there's just more work to be done, right? I mean, So yes, right, at the moment, we haven't figured out how to get these two things together, how to fit them together coherently in a way that everybody can agree on. But, we just have to work on it, right?
Right.
And that's, I think, quite a reasonable response. But I would just point out that I think that this argument does two things. First of all, it does show, again, that, anti-realism it's just like, it allows us to take a very sort of a simple response to this, right, where we have this history of failure over the history of philosophy, and we can give a very, very straightforward account of why that is, and why we can't fit them together, and so that, I think, does count in favor of anti-realism. The other thing it does is that I think it does undermine, again, the sort of realist appeal to intuitions. Because if it's right that these two forms of reasoning are essential to morality, to our moral thinking, and they're ineliminable, then the realist is going to have to engage in some quite significant moral reform. So the fact that anti-realism is counterintuitive then becomes less of a problem. I mean, some people find it. Some people say it's counterintuitive. I don't think it is, but
right,
yeah.
Well, another aspect of that could be, say the realist just responds with, sure, there's more work to be done so that we can, reconcile these two aspects of our moral reasoning. One response from the anti-realist could just be, okay, sure, well, maybe that can be done, but given that it hasn't been done yet, I don't see any reason to accept that it will be, right? Or that it could plausibly be, given, how it seems like we have so many viable attempts, like you mentioned, threshold deontology, rule utilitarianism, and they all seem to, in some way, have substantial problems. Yeah, I mean, that could be one possible objection.
One has to bear in mind, of course, that a lot of the realists you're talking to will, in fact, accept some of these theories. So, right. Saying, well, hey, look, there's been this history of failure, and we haven't come to any consensus on what these are, and threshold deontology has all these problems, they might say, well, actually, I think threshold deontology is just true, and here's how to solve those problems. I mean, like, I think in general in philosophy there are no knockdown arguments. We're always just weighing lots of different reasons, lots of different considerations. I would just put this this inconsistency argument on the table as something that might tip the scales in anti-realism's favour. Maybe that's how I should present it.
Right.
Like the realist is it's maybe just one way of really like bringing home the point about how much work the realist actually still has to do. I think that might be that the realist is taking on a burden that the anti-realist is not.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And the other sort of version of the argument from Cowie, I could just run through really quickly. I know you said obviously there's a lot of axioms with a lot of words, so I did actually write them down in anticipation of this coming up, right? So, I mean, Cowie's argument is basically this, right? And I assume most people listening to this probably won't get it like the first time around, so I'd suggest you can read Cowie's paper. It's called A New Argument for Moral Error Theory, or you can watch Kane's video about it, where he sort of explains the axioms in more detail.
The Incoherence of Morality is
right.
the title of that video.
I'll put that in the link in the description as well. Yeah. So there's basically two claims being made by Cowie, and it's also similar to the two claims that are made by your argument, which is one, there's a sort of first order incoherence in moral judgment, and two, this first order incoherence entails moral error theory, or counts in favor of moral error theory at least. And Cowie proves this by having us consider 5 different axioms. One is the egalitarian dominance condition, which basically says if population A is a perfectly equal population of the same size as population B, and every person in A has a higher welfare than every person in B, then A is better than B, other things being equal. The second condition is the weak non-sadism condition, which is just that there is a negative welfare level and a number of lives at this level such that an addition of any number of people with positive welfare is at least as good as an addition of the lives with negative welfare, other things being equal. There's the general non-extreme priority condition, which is for any welfare level A in any population X, there is a number of n lives such that a population consisting of the X lives, n lives with a very high welfare, and 1 life with welfare A is at least as good as a population consisting of the X lives, n lives with a very low positive welfare, and 1 with welfare slightly above A, other things being equal. These are so hard to read. And then there's just 2 more. The fourth one is the weak quality addition condition, which is that for any population X, there's a perfectly equal population with a very high positive welfare and a very negative welfare level, and a number of lives at this level such that the addition of the high welfare population to X is at least as good as the addition of any population consisting of the lives with negative welfare and any number of lives with very low positive welfare to X, other things being equal. And the other one, the fifth one, was such a mouthful that I just copy and pasted a rewording of it, which is basically that if you take 2 populations where everybody in the first is much better off than everybody in the second, adding just 1 person to the second population who is marginally better off than everybody at the first does not make the second population better than the first. And so those are the 5 axioms, and the argument basically just goes that all 5 axioms by themselves are conceptual moral truths. So in other words, they're so self-evident that if anything is morally true, these things are morally true. And if these axioms are all conceptual truths, and yet they're inconsistent, then this proves that our moral concepts themselves are defective, and that therefore we should reject judgments based on those concepts. So that's my basic understanding of the argument. I'm not sure if you had anything you want to add to that interpretation.
No, that's how I understand it. I should just say, I mean, if somebody hasn't encountered this argument before, then the idea that those are self-evident conceptual truths probably seems utterly implausible. But Cowie does address that point. In fact, I mean, a lot of those are like, the situation is more, it's they're phrased in a very technical way, but like once you understand what they're actually saying, I think pretty much everybody would be like, oh yeah, that's clearly true. Like,
Right.
so it's that sort of thing where it's just like they have to be stated in that very technical way, but once you understand them, they do all, I think, seem highly intuitive, right?
Right.
Do you know what? I think that my argument is better than Cowie's argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, just for one example of how self-evident, some of these are, like the first one is literally just imagine we have two populations. They're completely equal in everything except one population, everybody has a better life than everybody in the other population. And then the claim is that that would be better, right? And I mean, that seems to be like pretty undeniably like it would be, as Kawi says, it would be baffling for somebody
Yeah.
to even to disagree with that. Yeah, but I do think there is something to those to that genre of argument, which is basically just that like if there genuinely is these irreconcilable conflicts over inherent parts of our moral reasoning or conceptual truths about morality, then if morality itself is just internally incoherent, then the realist isn't in a good place, I guess. Yes, I think that those are very interesting arguments. And I think the last consideration that you mentioned was the sort of, I guess, the sort of feeling that it seems more rational to be sort of intransigent in the face of moral disagreement, or it seems more permissible to ignore like experts in the field of morality than it would to ignore experts in the field of like, some empirical scientific subject. How would you sort of, I guess, cash out that consideration?
Yeah. So the way that I kind of think about this, so I should say that this isn't an argument that I've actually read up that much on. I think it was somebody, McGrath, had an article about it. I think it was like Sarah McGrath, but I might be wrong about the first name there. But yeah, so the thought is that in the moral domain, there's something very weird about the idea of deferring to moral experts. In fact, it seems so. Like, if I come to believe, right, that abortion is wrong, right, and you ask me why, it seems like I should give you reasons, right, that are in favour of that position, instead of just saying, well, because Frank believes that abortion is wrong, and Frank's an expert, right? So like that just seems bizarre, right? And in the case of many other domains, when it comes to domains about which there are facts and about which access to those facts requires some expertise, we do defer to experts. Like it seems perfectly reasonable to say, okay, it's going to rain tomorrow. Why is it going to rain tomorrow? Well, because that's what the weather report said. And the assumption is that the people doing the weather report have the relevant expertise. Or if I say, I believe that, I don't know, the Andromeda galaxy is going to collide with the Milky Way in 5 billion years or whatever it is, it seems like a perfectly reasonable answer to why I believe that is because that is the consensus of astronomers. But we don't do that in the moral case. And so the thought is that, well, again, this is something that it's not obvious how to account for that in a realist framework. Like, if there are moral facts and if there are experts who have access to those facts, which certainly a realist would want to say, if there's no experts if people don't have access to moral facts, then, you end up with moral skepticism, not moral realism. So, it's not obvious why we don't defer to people. I mean, we do defer in some respects, right? So I suppose that if somebody has relevantly similar sentiments to us, then like when we defer, it might be because we recognize that really the sort of grounds for the deference is that they maybe have better empirical knowledge. So, like, you know, maybe somebody says that, I don't know, some tribe is worse than another tribe with respect to their treatment of women, right? Again, I might defer to them on that because I just assume that we have the same values about how women should be treated, and I assume that they have better knowledge of these two societies, right? So yeah, that's fine. But like to actually defer about like how women should be treated, right? Should women be treated equally? That's just weird, right? I actually think that we can push this a bit further. So I like to sometimes use the example of a moral property detector, right? So imagine that scientists were to develop somehow like a literal moral property detector, right? So you point it at various things, and maybe it's got like a dial on it, and the dial kind of moves one way or the other. Maybe this is a silly example, but you know, I hopefully for it's a thought experiment, so just go with it, right? So like we point the detector at slavery, and the dial like goes here. We point the detector at murder, and the dial's like that, and then we point the detector at somebody giving to charity, and the dial goes like this, right? So it seems like, okay, morally good, morally bad, right? And so we're literally detecting moral properties with our moral property detector. But then, right, we point the moral property detector at some homosexuals, and the dial does this, right? So it's saying that, and it's like, it's really bad, right? It's like saying that this is as bad as slavery. And so it seems at least plausible, right? Like, okay, maybe somebody might do this, right? Somebody might then come to the conclusion that homosexuality is objectively morally wrong, right? But that doesn't seem like it would make any difference to, or it seems like it shouldn't make any difference. Maybe I shouldn't be using terms like shouldn't here. I'll just talk about myself rather than other people, right? Like here's the thing, right? Me, myself, I might then come to the conclusion, okay, homosexuality is objectively morally wrong, but that's not going to change anything about my my attitude to homosexuality. I'm going to continue to promote tolerance of alternative sexualities. I'm going to continue, praising people who are tolerant and blaming people who engage in intolerant behaviour. I still want to live in a society in which people are free to, engage in all kinds of sexual deviance. Okay. And then the point is it seems like, I don't know, there's something weird, like there are objective moral facts, but they don't make any difference to us. I mean, when I think about this kind of case, the sort of view that I draw is, morality is something that's connected to our practices of like praise and blame. It's connected to our our general like social cooperation, and we're not really like describing facts in the world. Although we maybe think of moral judgments as being like facts, we project our moral attitudes. But I mean, ultimately, I don't. I think there would be something very strange about the idea of not just deferring to moral experts, but deferring to the moral facts. And then that makes me think that the idea of moral facts is just confused.
Right.
I'm not sure if that argument made sense.
Yeah, I think it does, right? Because it's like, if it when it comes to the sort of the goodness detector, it's like, if knowing the moral fact has no influence on how I feel about something, well, then it seems like the concept of moral facts starts to be devoid of any of the characteristics that we want to talk about when we really talk about morality, which means maybe the concept of a moral fact is just kind of nonsensical in a certain sense. When it comes to oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, just to clarify, I should say that if you are a realist, then I mean you should endorse the idea that a moral property detector is possible in principle, right? Because humans would actually count as types of moral property detectors. So, this again, it's maybe like a silly idea, like pointing a detector at something, but at least in principle, that is actually well, I mean, not just in principle, it's what actually happens when we come to know what the moral facts are. But yeah, I think that for me the issue is it's not just that it seems weird to defer to moral experts. To me, it seems weird to defer to moral facts. And so now I think, well, like clearly then, moral discourse is not really, tracking the facts. I should point out that, again, this is another argument that like I've presented to other anti-realists, and a lot of them have said that it's a very bad argument. So completely unmoved.
Yeah, so I mean, would I be correct in saying that maybe there's two arguments there? The first one is that if it seems reasonable to not change how we feel about a moral issue, even if we had a goodness detector and it told us the moral facts, right? That sort of feeling entails two things. One, it entails that the things that we care about and that we have moral discourse about aren't really tracking moral truth. And the other entailment would be that moral truth starts to become less and less coherent a concept, because it seems like it starts losing the properties that we generally think are a part of what moral truth would entail, right? Would you think that's like a good understanding of it?
Yeah, I think so. Although I would have some caution about framing it in terms of moral truth, just because, as I mentioned earlier, I think there are some philosophical views of truth on which truth can be had very cheaply, and like you wouldn't necessarily need to be postulating moral facts in the realist sense in order to have moral truth. So with that caveat said, I think that's maybe it is. Maybe there are two arguments here.
Right. So, okay, and that makes sense. And then with regards to the appeal to, it seems rational not to really trust or not to just defer to moral experts. Would you think of that as sort of like maybe an inductive argument where it seems kind of obvious that this property of it being rational to defer to experts seems to be a component of things that are truly factual disputes, and the fact that that feature isn't a part of moral discourse somewhat counts in favor of the idea that maybe moral discourse isn't truly a real factual dispute, or doesn't concern factual disputes?
I don't think I would characterize it inductively. I don't know if maybe it should be more just characterized in terms of, like, I don't know, norms of belief formation or something. So, I mean, like, again, I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm really making an induction, right? Like, let me think about this. So the thought is that in the case of... So, if we believe that there are facts about a certain domain D, right, and we believe that humans have access to these facts, but the access is differential, right, which certainly is something that a moral realist is going to say, right? Like, some people have better access to the facts than others. So in that case, we would be able to identify certain people who are experts, right? The people who have, like, the best access to the facts. It just seems like, just in general, it makes sense to defer to people who are experts. And the reason why it makes sense to do that is just because we are every day, like, just overloaded with information. I mean, we kind of have to offload cognitive labor, right? Like, you have to defer to people about all sorts of things. I mean, in any specific situation, you might be able to do your own research, but you can't do that for all of the beliefs that you're going to have. Like, I mean, when it comes, because there's just so many things in life that you have to have beliefs about. And so, we defer to the expertise of plumbers, we defer to the expertise of, doctors, we defer to the expertise of scientists, we defer to the expertise of philosophers. I mean, like, I know, more about the history of philosophy than somebody else who hasn't done philosophy. So it would make sense to defer to me on that, or maybe not me, but at least some other philosopher maybe. But I mean, that's just, again, it's not really an inductive point. It's just a point about what seems to be a matter of like reasonable belief formation. And so, yeah, I mean, the fact that seems bizarre in the moral case is a little bit difficult to account for under a realist framework. I mean, it's a problem, right? Like, obviously, there are realist responses to this, as there are to all of the arguments. I mean, I don't think this is a knockdown argument or anything, but it's just like, for an anti-realist, right? Like, if we think of moral judgments as ultimately being projections of our attitudes or something like that, you've got a very straightforward explanation for why this is. A very simple explanation, and the realist has a bit more work to do.
And I think given that that's sort of given that that's, I think, the last key point with regards to arguments for anti-realism, I think it could be interesting to touch on the sort of meta point here, which is just that, and I am certain I've heard you agree with this sentiment before, which is just that when it comes to like these sorts of debates, maybe the idea of like a knockdown argument or like one argument that ends the debate isn't what we should really be looking for. Maybe that idea is a bit silly. And it seems like our judgment about, should we be moral realists, should we be moral anti-realists, is more going to concern a plethora of different considerations which kind of tip the scales in both directions. Do you kind of agree with that sort of meta assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's probably the case in philosophy in general. I mean, I'm not sure if there really are any knockdown arguments in philosophy. Like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a few, but just in general, when it comes to any philosophical debate, it seems like we're just weighing up lots of different things on both sides. Now, I mean, it so happens, like, I happen to think that there are a whole bunch of arguments for anti-realism that are pretty persuasive, right? I mean, I find them reasonably compelling. They pull me in that direction. And I mean, for me, there is just, on the realist side, I have literally never heard an argument for realism that I thought was even close to being compelling. But, I mean, now part of the reason for that is because, I have certain views in epistemology. Like, there are certain background epistemological views that I have. If somebody disagrees with me on them, I can understand why they might find certain arguments for moral realism compelling. So, I'm pretty... I mean, another thing is just the sort of background assumptions or background beliefs that we have when we start doing philosophy. So I can say that in my case, right, like I was always attracted to a pretty hardcore kind of anti-realism. In fact, I remember being like 12 years old and arguing with people online about these kinds of topics, and I was always an anti-realist. For me, it actually started when I used to post on forums for film and music and stuff, and one of the things you encounter if you post in those kinds of places is people who are objectivists about aesthetic value. And when I encountered this idea, like, so there are people who will claim, for instance, that, the film 2001 is objectively better than the latest Michael Bay film, or that, like, the Beatles are objectively better than Yoko Ono. And, when I encountered this, I just thought it was completely insane. It was like people saying they believed in elves and pixies. I thought it was crazy. And then, of course, in the course of these arguments, I discover not only do they believe in objective aesthetic values, they also believe in objective moral values. Like, what the hell is this? They're postulating all these crazy things. I thought it was totally nuts. And I'm having engaged with philosophy, I have softened my position. I'm no longer going to claim that it's completely crazy to be a moral realist. But look, if you just have a different sort of psychological constitution to me, and you happen to be attracted to thinking in realist terms, then, naturally, you're going to be more persuaded by the arguments for realism. Like, you have no choice but to start with the beliefs that you start with, right? Like, that's how it is for all of us. So, no doubt part of the reason why I'm an anti-realist now is I was an anti-realist back when I started.
Hmm. Yeah. Right. And so concerning some of the, um, I agree with your sentiment. I haven't yet come across a argument for, I guess, moral realism that I find particularly persuasive, but I also don't have that great a read of the literature. Um, so I guess just to touch on maybe a couple of them, one of the arguments that's been made that's become relatively popular in the sort of in the literature has been the companions and guilt argument,
Mm-hmm.
which basically, for those who aren't familiar, the companions and guilt argument, and this sort of connects with something you said earlier when you corrected me on, I said that a moral anti-realist believes that there aren't categorical reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and the companions and guilt argument basically says that if there aren't categorical reasons for action, or like categorical, which are, I guess, moral reasons, then by parity of reason, we're also going to have to reject categorical reasons for belief.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, then the follow up argument is that if we reject categorical reasons for belief, then that kind of leads to a sort of a self undermining position where it's like, well, if we don't have reason to believe anything, then we don't have any reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist. And so the way that's kind of been put is that there's two sort of parts to a companions and guilt argument. The first one is the existence premise, which is that epistemic facts exist. And the other one is the parity premise, which is just if epistemic facts exist, then by parity of reason, moral facts also exist. And that's kind of become a popular argument for the moral realist position. So I was just wondering what you sort of make of that argument.
I think it's a really bad argument. Bluntly, there are so many. Okay, look, maybe I shouldn't say that because there's so many people who endorse it.
Yeah.
A part of my annoyance with this, right, like, is just that I don't know. Maybe this is just a bad experience on my part, right? But I have encountered like so many people who are moral realists who present this argument in like a really smug kind of way. Like it's just like I've encountered people who seem to think this is like a knockdown argument against anti-realism. And look, I mean, I accept that yes, there is an interesting challenge here, but that's about as much as you're going to get. Again, that's as much as you're going to get from any philosophical argument, and certainly this particular argument, I think there's so many ways out. So, I mean, okay. First of all, I tend to just accept epistemic anti-realism in the following sense. I will tend to just accept that there are no categorical reasons for belief. Doesn't necessarily mean there are no reasons for belief. It means there's no categorical reasons for belief. So what you do is say, well, our epistemic judgments, right, ultimately reduce, or our reasons to believe reduce to, on the one hand, the desires that agents have with respect to belief formation, such as, for instance, our desire to believe the truth and our desire not to believe falsehood, right? And then you can appeal to non-normative evidential support relations. So the idea would be that, I mean, so a very simple example would be something like claiming that, I don't know, like probability judgments, right? So, you know, if X makes Y, you know, more probable, and, you know, you believe X, then, you know, maybe believe Y, like something like that. So maybe like observing smoke above a forest makes it probable that the forest is on fire, right? That's not obviously a normative relation. I mean, there are arguments that ultimately evidential relations are normative, but there are also arguments against that. So, you know, there's a debate going on here, but the line that we might try to draw is, so the line we might try to take is to say there are no categorical reasons, there are no reasons for belief that like bind you independent of your desires, right? Ultimately, again, it just reduces to hypothetical reasons where we have the desire to believe truth and avoid falsehood, and we can account for evidential support relations in non-normative terms. That's one option. Another option, which I think is just as plausible as a response, is to say, well, like, look, there are significant differences between, you know, like evidential reasons, reasons for belief, and reasons for action. So, I mean, for one thing, our norms concerning like our epistemic judgments, right? Epistemic norms are brought against the tribunal of experience in a way that moral norms just aren't. So what I mean by that is, right, if you look at, the history of science, what you find is that scientists aren't just judging theories, they're also judging norms of theory formation. So there was a time, for instance, when there was a general consensus that acceptable scientific theories had to provide mechanistic explanations, right? Like they had to explain things in terms of like pushes and pulls. If you assume that the world just consists of atoms in the void, if that sort of naive materialism, then you want to give an explanation of gravity, for instance, in terms of like atoms pushing and pulling each other. And so, a big debate between like Cartesian and Newtonian approaches was the Cartesian was able to do that, right? Descartes provided an explanation of gravity in terms of like vortexes of atoms. Newton didn't. But Newton triumphed, right? Because the evidence came fully in on Newton's side, right? It turns out that Newtonian mechanics is far more successful than the Cartesian approach. So we just dropped that norm of theory formation, right? We no longer require our theories to provide mechanistic explanations. That kind of thing doesn't seem to happen in the moral case. So there's a significant difference, right? I think that there are... those are just a couple of responses that you might take to this sort of argument. I think there are plenty of other ones as well. Another one I like, I'm just going to mention this because, like, why not, is that it seems like beliefs... so what we might say is that beliefs just aim at truth. So there's something kind of bizarre about somebody saying, X is true, but I don't believe it, right? Like, that would just be like what? It would seem like they just don't understand what they're saying, right? If somebody was to claim, oh yeah, I think it's true that Joe Biden is president of the United States, but I don't believe it. Like, it would just be... So it seems like just, necessarily beliefs seem to aim at truth. And you can even give a kind of, evolutionary story about how that would come about because, organisms need to represent their environments, and so they end up having this capacity for mental representation. And then there is a certain class of representations which are designed to represent the environments correctly, something like that, But the point is, it seems like we have this capacity to form certain mental states which aim at truth, and those we call beliefs. So if you give an argument to the effect that something is true, you have thereby given an argument for believing it. Now let's think about action, right? Actions don't aim at anything in particular, right? Like an action, if I perform an action, that doesn't necessarily aim to be other regarding or to do anything else, right? Like I can, perform an action just for my own sake. The idea that, giving an argument to the effect that an action would help other people or would be morally good or something like that, that's not in itself an argument for doing the action. So there's so many ways of dealing, I think, with the companions in guilt argument. I don't find it persuasive for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with that assessment. One interesting point that I guess might relate to, the concept of a reason more generally, towards the beginning of that is just, you make this point about how, you make a point about how, with respect to, sort of, it seems like there are, like, you can have an evidential support relation that doesn't necessarily constitute a reason, or you could cash out the epistemic anti-realist position as I can form beliefs through a process of a hypothetical norm, like I have a preference for, or I have a desire to pursue truth, and then there are non-normative evidential support relations, but that ultimately that I want to pursue truth, that's not going to be binding. That's just going to be whether or not I form beliefs based on that is going to be dependent on whether or not I have that desire. And I think maybe one potential response to that could be that maybe there seems to be something that isn't entirely voluntary about our belief formation process as compared to the process of us, performing certain actions, right? Like, I could have a desire to believe false things, but if I see a bird outside of my window, I'm still going to just sort of automatically believe that there's a bird outside of my window. So maybe in that respect, you could try and say that it's not actually just a hypothetical norm. Like, you are going to believe these things regardless of a desire. What would you make of a response like that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I would just point out that what we've done there is shown that there actually is a relevant difference between moral
Right.
norms and epistemic norms, right? So I mean, this is a kind of like, it goes back to Mackey's argument about how there's something like realists have conceived moral norms as being necessarily motivating, right? I mean, what you've described there is actually a case just like that, right? Where regardless of what I want, right, when I look out and see the bird outside the window, it just kind of forces me to have that belief. I just do believe it, right? And I mean, I would say, well, yeah, but the very fact that there is no process like that happening in the moral case, right? The very fact that you can have a sociopath who just doesn't give a shit about, sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear.
No, that's fine.
Right, okay, yeah, he just doesn't care, let's say, about seeing somebody, burn a dog alive or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, that seems then like you've got a relevant difference between those cases. At least if I understood the objection correctly, maybe I.
No, yeah, I think that is the right response, and that kind of that in some sense relates to sort of Cowie's more meta objection that there might just be like a tension between the parity premise and the existence premise, where either it's completely trivial or it just doesn't work. So yeah, I think that is an interesting response. And I guess the only other argument that I could think of, because I mean, there's sort of three arguments for realism that I traditionally have encountered. The first one is companions and guilt. The second one is the sort of, Morean shift or intuitionism.
Can I just clarify something?
Yeah.
So, and this is very important. The companions and guilt argument, at least in my view, isn't actually an argument for realism. The only thing that the companions and guilt argument would do is undermine a specific argument for the error theory. So, like, I mean, in particular, right, the problem that the error theorists have identified with moral judgments is that they seem to contain this commitment to categorical normativity, right? They say, hey, there's this problem with the idea of categorical reasons for action. But not every error theorist would need to say that. I mean, it's not obvious that Mackey said that, right? Like, Mackey's problem was with the idea of like things in the world that necessarily motivate us. So, you wouldn't necessarily have to rest your argument for the error theory on this objection to categorical reasons for action. But it seems to me that's pretty much all you get with the companions in guilt. Like, if the companions in guilt argument works, it shows that there is no problem with the idea of categorical reasons for action. But it doesn't do anything at all to address, for example, the evolutionary debunking argument, or the argument from first order inconsistency. It doesn't really do anything to address concerns about like the epistemic access to moral facts. It doesn't address the point about deference to experts. So there's a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, I would say that it's it's not, even if it's successful, I don't think you're going to get realism out of it.
Yeah, I do agree that companions and guilt seems to. It's strange because I have heard it used as sort of a positive argument for realism, but I do agree with you that it almost seems to only make sense in the context of being sort of a defensive argument against common things that are said against realism. And even in that context, I don't think it works for the sort of considerations that we were just talking about. Yeah. So with respect to I guess maybe other potential considerations, um, one that another I guess argument for realism that I've encountered that I find completely unpersuasive is, I guess, the sort of appeal to moral convergence, right? Where the idea is that what we've seen is that over time, different people and different societies are kind of converging upon, in humor's case, his appeal is to like liberal values, right? Like we're converging upon certain moral values, and this would be expected on the realist hypothesis because there's some moral truth of the matter and everybody's moving closest to it. But on the anti-realist hypothesis, this wouldn't be expected, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so I guess I'm wondering because my sort of initial gut reaction to that was I don't
Sorry,
know
can I
why
just
it
ask
wouldn't.
something?
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
humor's case. You're talking about Michael Humour.
Yeah. Yeah. Michael Humer. Yeah.
I haven't read his his convergence argument,
Hmm.
but has he? I mean, like, I'm just curious. Like, it seems like things are not converging in the way in towards what he would consider the moral truth to be, because he's an anarcho-capitalist, and we're definitely not converging towards that. Like, so
Yeah.
I mean, like, has he commented on that at all?
I don't know what his response to that specifically is. I do know that his appeal is to just, I guess, maybe he thinks that we're just not, maybe he thinks that eventually we will, we will
But it
converge
doesn't seem
upon.
like we're even going in
Yeah.
that direction, right?
Yeah.
Like,
No.
I mean,
Yeah.
states are becoming like, we've developed welfare states, and they're becoming more and more involved in the market and all of that. I mean, or at least it seems to be,
Yeah.
as far as I can, as far as I can tell. Uh,
Yeah.
so, yeah,
I
it
mean,
just seemed
that would
odd
be, yeah.
that he would have made that kind of argument. But okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean it would be interesting to hear his response to that appeal. But yeah, I mean my gut reaction to that argument is just sort of I don't know why it would be unexpected upon the or unexpected on the anti-realist hypothesis given like I mean it just sort of is a geopolitical matter. What we've seen is increasing degrees of like globalization, right? Like
Yeah.
societies are just becoming more interconnected in aspects that are utterly unrelated to morality. So, I mean, it wouldn't seem that strange that our moral beliefs are kind of intermingling more as well. Would you kind of take that approach as well?
Yeah, I think so. I would take two lines on this. I would say, first of all, it seems like if there is this kind of convergence happening, we can, I think, quite easily account for it under anti-realist assumptions. I mean, so, again, if you buy into the idea of the evolutionary debunking argument, then presumably you're going to give some story about the sort of capacities that humans, and these are going to be capacities that all humans have, like everywhere, right? Like all of us are going to share. All societies are going to share certain tendencies, let's say, as a result of our evolutionary history. And so if an anti-realist buys into that, right, then they can easily then explain convergence in terms of those shared values, let's say, plus just like people coming to have the same empirical knowledge, or people coming to have very similar lifestyles, as you say, as a result of globalization. I actually also though would question whether we really have evidence of the kind of convergence that realists sometimes appeal to. And the only thing is, it's like, yeah, if I look over the history of, I don't know, Western society, then I can see a convergence towards, something like liberal democracy, maybe. But I'm not sure about projecting that into the future. I mean, and let's just ignore problems like climate change. Let's just imagine that, the world is going to continue in something like the way it is now. Like, I don't know. I mean, are countries such as China exhibiting the kind of convergence to, say, liberal values that we've had? I mean, maybe it's going in that direction, but like, I don't know a lot about, say, China and Russia and these other countries, but it like, at least initially, again, I'm very, very ignorant of these places, but my initial response to them is that it seems like, they have very different values, and they don't seem to be moving in a liberal direction. I can't help but think that maybe like this convergence that we have on, say, liberal democracy is really just a product of the fact that liberal democracies happened to be the most powerful and therefore the most influential, and also they, like, I mean, they're not just influential, but like in some cases, literally, invaded other countries and forced them to adopt similar values. So I'm not sure that I see that kind of convergence happening. But that maybe doesn't matter so much because, like I said, I think we can just account for convergence if it is happening in anti-realist terms anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think that sort of covers the arguments that you found persuasive for anti-realism, and then some of the arguments that I've encountered for realism. I guess the other main argument for realism would just kind of be the sort of, Morean shift, intuitionist argument of, well, we should trust our intuitions, and then it's very intuitive that obviously you shouldn't kill babies or something like that, and therefore we should accept moral realism. And obviously, I don't think we have to go that much into that because I would say that's kind of been responded to in some of the positive arguments for anti-realism, like the evolutionary debunking argument and Cowie's argument and your argument kind of already have given the objections to that, unless you are familiar with anything else that you would kind of appeal to.
There is another thing I would say in response to that argument, which is that I think that we don't actually have the kind of intuitions that the realist needs. So I'm quite happy with the idea that, like we look at a baby being killed and we just immediately say that's wrong, right? Like we have that as a gut reaction, right? That is wrong. But do we have the intuition that it is true that killing babies is wrong? Or, it is a fact that killing babies is wrong? That's not so obvious at all. And I mean, I know that I do not have that intuition, because when I encountered moral realism, I thought it was completely crazy. So to me, right, the idea that it is a fact that killing babies is wrong, or it is true that killing babies is wrong, those seem totally counterintuitive. And I think that there are probably a lot of people who are quite similar to me. I mean, philosophers often complain, at least people who, teach ethics and stuff, often complain about the kind of naive relativism of like first-year undergraduates who are encountering ethics for the first time. And they complain about it because like they often end up encountering students who just say, well, it's all just a matter of opinion. Right. And, even if you're an anti-realist, you don't want to just say it's all a matter of opinion. You've still got to engage with the arguments and everything. So that's why philosophers who teach these things often find it a bit frustrating that there are so many, naive relativists. But the very existence of those naive relativists in the philosophy classrooms suggests to me that realist intuitions are far less common than realists sometimes claim. So yeah, I would just say that I don't think the intuitions count unless the intuition is that it is a fact that X is wrong, or it is true that X is wrong. Just having a kind of gut reaction of liking or disliking is not enough. And again, actually, I mean, you drew this comparison earlier to gastronomic values, the value of different foods, right? Like chocolate ice cream, right? Like I eat chocolate ice cream and like immediately I have this gut reaction like that's lovely. But does that mean that I have the intuition that there are gastronomic facts, that there are facts about the value of ice cream? I mean, that's not obvious at all.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's sort of how I've thought about this, where it's this thing where it's like, well, isn't it so intuitive that you shouldn't kill babies? And it's like, well, it's extremely intuitive that I have an aversion to people killing babies. Mm-hmm. But if the question is it intuitive that you have like a spooky external normative reason not to kill babies? Well, then no, I don't find that intuitive. Yeah, I think that is interesting. And I guess sort of one other thing that I wanted to get to, because I did want to spend most of the time touching on whether or not there are sort of objective moral values, because I think that's the more interesting side of error theory. But there's this other side of okay, well, assuming that that's true, right? There are different theories of what moral discourse is taken to mean, right? So, like, obviously, a non-cognitivist will say that moral statements aren't truth apt; they're just expressions of an emotion. Like, abortion is bad doesn't mean, as the error theorist would say, that there's a fact that abortion is bad. It just means, like, boo abortion. And similarly, a subjectivist will say that abortion is bad just means I have a preference that people shouldn't do abortion. So I guess I was interested in how you sort of parse out that question, or how you think we should determine the sort of the meaning of moral discourse, and why you think we should prefer error theory over the other sort of primary anti-realist schools in terms of giving an account of the meaning of moral discourse.
Okay, yeah. I should say that I don't really care that much. Like,
right, yeah.
So, I actually used to be a non-cognitivist, or at least I used to identify as a non-cognitivist. But I also don't think that this really matters. I mean, part of it is that I'm not sure that there's really, like, just a general fact of the matter about what moral statements mean. So maybe I should say that my conception of philosophy, or at least my conception of a lot of what we do in philosophy, is that it's not really, like, when we ask what does this discourse mean, like what is knowledge, or what is justice, or something like that, part of what we're doing is describing how those concepts are actually used, right? Like, obviously we need to pay some attention. If we're asking a question like what is knowledge, we need to pay some attention to how people use those words. Similarly, if we're talking about morality and we want to ask how to understand moral judgments, we need to pay some attention to how people actually use moral judgments. But I think that in philosophy in general, what a big part of what we're doing is kind of conceptual engineering, right? Because our everyday language is vague and messy and imprecise, and part of what we should be trying to do in philosophy is figure out what sort of role does, say, the concept of knowledge or the concept of morality, what sort of role is that playing, right? And then can we, like, precisify the concept and in such a way that it still plays the relevant roles. And so, as I see it, this debate between non-cognitivists and error theorists isn't just a debate about how people actually use moral language, but also a debate about how it would be most useful to conceive of moral language. Like, I think there probably are plenty of cases where people make moral statements and actually they are just expressing emotions. Like, I mean, certainly if you imagine somebody who's at a protest or something, and, like, they I don't know, maybe they're protesting abortion or something like that, right? And they're really angry and screaming. Well, yeah, maybe they are just expressing emotions, right? I think that error theory is preferable when it comes to, like, accounting for what philosophers are doing, for example, because if you look at a lot of literature in professional ethics, it's pretty implausible to interpret that as just people expressing emotions, say. I mean, there are ways of making the non-cognitivist view work, but it's just, like, prima facie, right? It seems like professional ethicists are just exploring what they take to be beliefs. So I think that there's that. Also the fact that I think that you can account for the like the things that make non-cognitivism appealing within an error theoretic framework, because you can just draw on the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. Like, if I get angry with you and I, like, shout, like, "There's the door," well, I'm expressing anger, I'm expressing the command that you get out, but I'm doing it by means of a statement that actually is just a proposition that is either true or false. Like, if I was to say "there's the door," that would be false because there's no door over there. But yeah, I don't really care that much about the question of there are these specific questions of like meaning of moral statements. So I'm not like deeply wedded to error theory over non-cognitivism. It just seems a lot simpler, I think, is the answer to that.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So I guess the final the final question here is just given that, and this was sort of alluded to earlier, given that uh, you're of the belief that there aren't objective sort of moral values, what do you think? Sort of, where do we go from here in terms of moral discourse? Are you sympathetic to the idea that we should just abandon moral discourse? Do you think it's productive to use moral discourse maybe as a tool of persuasion? I guess, like, what role is there for moral talk in light of anti-realist considerations?
Well, I am sympathetic to moral abolitionism. I'm sympathetic to the idea that just do away with morality. I'm sympathetic to it, but here's the problem. I just like really enjoy engaging in the use of moral discourse. So like I'm just going to carry on doing that. So I mean, like I think there are some really interesting arguments on the abolitionist side. I really like Max Stirner. I have no, it's not pronounced like that. I was told that it's pronounced Stirner. So but I just enjoy making moral judgments, right? So I'm going to carry on doing it. No, I think that if I was to give like a more substantive argument for one way of proceeding rather than another, it seems to me that moral discourse does seem to play some sort of useful role, right? It's probably a useful tool for promoting social cooperation and all of that. Like pretty much every society, right, has had like this means of judging things in terms of morality, and has sort of conceived of, pretty much every society has had this means of conceiving of themselves as being, bound by reasons that are independent of their desires. And it seems like maybe there is something useful about that. Like it maybe provides first of all, just from a sort of purely individual point of view, like extra motivation. Like I'm not just going to follow whatever desires I happen to have, but it maybe encourages me to behave more cooperatively, which is more useful to me in the long run. And obviously, it's useful to me for other people to do that as well. So yeah, I'm kind of happy with the idea that this is playing some sort of useful role. And I just enjoy engaging in moral discourse. What I would say is that the way I conceive of it is as being essentially like a fiction, right? So we just proceed as if there were these categorical reasons, even though there actually aren't. In the same way as, if we want to send probes to Pluto, we just proceed as if Newtonian mechanics was true, because that simplifies the equations, right? Rather than using general relativity. We just take a theory which we know is false, but act as if it's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. I think I agree with that prescription. It also just like, given that I have certain desires, and given that, so many people are bought into, moral talk, it seems like if I want to achieve those desires through, political mechanisms, it's just going to be greatly beneficial, tactically to use moral language.
It's very difficult to remove it from one's vocabulary, I think. I have occasionally like thought to myself, okay, how do I go about like doing this? Like if I was to really take abolitionism seriously. A good example of this is I mentioned Max Stirner, and there is a tradition of egoistic anarchism that was inspired by him, and those people are abolitionists. They think we should do away with morality. But if you ever engage with this particular group of people, you will find them constantly making moral judgments. They won't put it in exactly those terms, but they do. And it always amuses me to see how, like, even people who are, seemingly really committed to the abolitionist cause end up just, like, you just fall into it. It's so natural. It's such a natural way of conceiving of things that it's very, very difficult. And what's the point? Like, what's the point of like forcing oneself not to engage in this discourse that doesn't really seem to, be causing any problems? Well, actually, maybe I shouldn't say that, because maybe it depends on the sort of moral views that people hold, right? Maybe some of them are causing problems, but just in itself, like thinking of things in terms of what ought and ought not to be done, seems okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all that I had in terms of different things to talk about. If you have any sort of additional thoughts that were related to anything that was said that you didn't get to address, definitely feel free to do that. Otherwise, I guess just reiterate where people could find you if they're interested. And yeah.
Okay, I don't think I have any other thoughts. I think that that was everything. So my YouTube channel is Kane Baker 91 or Kane B. I suppose if you just type in Kane B philosophy on YouTube, it'll come up. And I don't really have anything else to say there. So yeah, that's everything.
Okay, yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. I enjoyed this conversation.
No, that was great. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course, anytime.
Cool.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.